Hi. Hey,
Hey, nice to
hopefully.
meet you, and I will shut up now and let you get started.
All right, cool. I will share my screen real quick and I need to adjust these things. I had a minor uh, thing with my external camera, so hopefully everyone can see. Cool. All good. All right. I
Yep,
will.
we have slides, we have video, and your voice is extremely clear.
Awesome. Awesome. So thanks so much. I'm really excited to be here today. I'm going to talk about narrative focused video games development with Ren'Py, which is an open source engine. I'll introduce a little bit about myself real quick. So, game dev is my hobby, and I guess for my job, I work as a principal data scientist at ClearCo. I'm also a contributing member at the Python Software Foundation, make some, I guess, like open source contributions here and there. I've also spoken about game dev with Python at PyCon US, Canada, India, and Taiwan. So now I'm here, which is, I'm really excited to be here. So now about the game dev in Quill Game Studio, I am the only developer. Hopefully that will change. But so far, that's been the case. I'm also the only producer, the PM, the writer, and marketing sales, and so far, everything else. I did start to hire contractors for writing, but previously that was all the hats that I had. So in 2017, I had an idea for a game. I like gaming, collect maybe too many games. Um, and had this idea. I wrote it out, and I was like, I have the story. Now what? Um, I found Ren'Py, and in the middle there was some other stuff I experimented with, like I guess like JavaScript. But then like in the end, Ren'Py was the way for me to get my ideas from paper to an actual game, and I shipped the game, and it actually sold around 10K copies in the first um, X, I guess like 2 quarters, 1.5 quarter. Um, but first, I'm going to give a little bit of an overview of this talk. So I will talk about the gaming industry a little bit, just so it kind of clears up what kind of game dev this is. And talk about narrative games, which is, I guess, like another subset of the games. And then I'll talk about Ren'Py and the kind of interesting parts about the Python development and stuff like that. Okay, so there is a pretty large market in gaming, and of course, we know there's different platforms. There is like different computer OSs and consoles, right? Like Linux, Mac, Windows, Nintendo Switch, Xbox One, PlayStation 4. There's also mobile, which Ren'Py can actually export to. But because I didn't do that for my first game, I won't talk about that too much. I want to make the distinction between very large companies. So, companies like Ubisoft, Activision, Blizzard Activision, who make games like FIFA games and Assassin's Creed games. These are ones with millions of dollars in budget, but also kind of like thousands or even hundreds of thousands of people working on them. So these are like the Hollywood movies, but for games, right? There's often millions of dollars in budget. You have Call of Duty, which had like 250 million in development and marketing costs, and so on and so forth. But there's another kind of way to make games, which are indie games, or which are short for independent games, right? Indie studios are smaller. There are, like there's less budget usually, but we can see for very popular indie games like Stardew Valley had, I guess when it first launched, it was primarily built by one person. And Terraria is also an indie game that a lot of people have played, which was made by a small team. Baba is You is also like very small team or one person creator. But these games have sold like millions of copies, hundreds of thousands or millions of copies, even with a small budget. And of course, we have some studios which are in the middle. They're kind of ambiguous. They have a huge player base and non-trivial budget, like PUBG. But I guess because they are a smaller team, I've seen them referred to as indie games as well. So I guess there is this kind of gray area in between. So I wanted to make that distinction because, like, I guess for people that are starting out and trying to make their own game, like myself, I would put myself in the indie category for sure because I do not have 250 million like sitting around, right? So I wanted to make that distinction of like the games that a person starting it as a hobby would um, be making. So second of all, I want to dive deeper into this kind of narrative driven games. To start off, I want to put forth a more of an experience, which is the Netflix movie Black Mirror. So it is a movie, but at times in the story, you can kind of choose to do one action or another. So, like, do you jump out the window or not jump out the window? Do you accept his offer or you don't accept his offer? When you select this on the browser UI, it actually plays another part of the movie. So the ending of the movie, or like the stuff you go through during the movie, changes with your interaction with the movie. So that is one of the narrative driven experiences that's not necessarily a game, but kind of a similar concept of like narrative that I wanted to put forth. A second example is this series called the Nonary games, or one of the games is called 999. So they were pretty popular on the I want to say like Nintendo DS or earlier. So they're fairly old games. So it's a murder mystery battle royale type of situation where you're with a group of people and people keep dying, and you try to solve mysteries and solve puzzles. So a lot of the gameplay is through reading these like dialogue that happens between the player character and the other characters. So you're experiencing the story basically through a ton of reading. That's fair to say. There's popular games like that, but then even more modern games like Persona 5 also has a lot of story exposition and dialogue that's conveyed through these dialogue boxes. And games like this, they do have another gameplay portion, but they have a huge amount of these dialogue that people really remember them for. Like, people remember Persona 5 for these stories, and these stories are well known and they have sold fairly well. Another example is Danganronpa, which is another, I guess, like horror battle royale. I don't know, people just kill each other type of situation, but you can see that a lot of the tenseness of the situation is conveyed through these like dialogue between the characters. So I want to say that, like, I've went from, yeah, it's narrative, you influence the timeline, you influence the events, to kind of a broad way of referring to this kind of game is visual novel. I want to say this is a very broad term, right? There's technically visual novels that have a lot of other types of gameplay, but I just want to make it clear that clearly this is not a first-person shooter or a MOBA game, right? Or a strategy. Well, there are strategy game and visual novel, right? But you can kind of start to clearly see the traits of this type of game, and they are quite commonly seen as well. And yeah, if you've never seen a game with some sort of dialogue box and all the narrative delivered with the dialogue box, well, I guess older Pokemon games as well as newer Pokemon games, you will know. Um, yeah, but the games I've mentioned previously, they were a lot of them were custom built, right? Because they do vary from smaller teams to larger teams, but they have their own engine. It's difficult to do that as an indie developer because I'm one person and I'm not gonna build another engine. So that's where Ren'Py comes in. Ren'Py, Python, love Python. Helped me enter independent or indie development. And I already used it in my full-time job, which is like data science and ML. So I'm already have some familiarity with it. And as folks in the community know, it has good documentation. And if you can't find the documentation, then there are people who will respond to you when you ask things. And you can make it like object-oriented programming if you there's just ways of designing things in games that are mostly OOP. So even in other languages that are used in game development, they can be done like philosophically in Python as well. So this is an open source engine. It's been used to make stuff from NaNoRenO games. NaNoRenO is like a month-long kind of like hackathon or game jam, as we call those hackathons in game dev world. So like very short sprint, low budget games to high budget games as well. And the creator, Python, he mentioned his philosophy is he wanted to make the best way to make visual novels and give it away for free. Yeah, and as I mentioned, some other engines typical in game dev, like Unreal Engine or Unity. Unreal uses C++, Unity uses C#, and a lot of the design patterns are transferable. Okay, so I wanted to mention one quick thing here is that I said that Ren'Py is beginner friendly. Um, Even for people who are not as familiar with Python, there's one thing that Ren'Py does, which is that it has a lexer in the back. So there are some things you can see in the left screenshot that they do not look like Python. Like, what is this add thing and this image button thing? But I have to say that for the most part, for stuff like the script, right? Because you saw that in the dialogue, you have like dialogue 1, dialogue 2, dialogue 3. It's very annoying if you have to look at all of that with all the brackets. So I find that using this kind of DSL or domain specific language syntax in Ren'Py, it does save a lot of hassle of especially the script or like the kind of screen direction of the characters going on and off screen, for example. You don't have to make sure all the brackets are there and all the methods and whatever. It will parse it in the end. So for some things, it doesn't look like Python, but it is helpful to do so for practical reasons. Um, I'm going to introduce some of the functionalities in Ren'Py to just kind of like give some inspiration. People might have heard of Doki Doki Literature Club, which is a visual novel that actually is 4 years old as of today, I believe. And it was a well-known horror novel that has been downloaded like millions of times. And I believe the sequel has also been purchased millions of times, or I don't know, hundreds of thousands of times at least. You can create effects like that. This is a very basic example of like transitions, but you can do like weather effects or some other types of animations as well. Other folks have mentioned Pygame, and I guess if for folks who are curious how this relates to Ren'Py, Ren'Py is kind of built on top of Pygame, which is a very popular, or I guess the most well-known game module or a set of Python modules for writing games. It also uses SDL, Simple Direct Media Layer, which is written in C, but is also usable in Python. But one interesting thing I want to mention is that Python, the creator of Ren'Py, actually, I think he like forked it basically so that he could add SDL2 compatibility. He forked SDL2 because I think Pygame still uses SDL, the original one. So in order to give Ren'Py users the ability to use the updated SDL, he has also made some modifications for Ren'Py in this situation. Yeah, and previously I added this like very brief one-liner example of like a transition. This was when I was at PyCon US, and I did this just like using a PNG to make this transition. Basically, like in normal games, it's not going to look like this, but I just wanted to show a very simple example of like this one-liner animation. Cool. And there's some other functions I'll go through, namely, I guess like for this, I wonder if the GIF, you can see it well. This is a game I'm working on, but to add parallax in Ren'Py, parallax is just like, if you have math modules, right? Like you can just calculate the distance and then kind of like a viewport, and then switch like the user's viewport based on your mouse movement. So if it's not super clear in this GIF, it's like when you move your mouse, you kind of like look around. So it kind of spices up the 2D aspect of these games quite a lot as well with parallax. This is another one. I don't know if you folks can see the video. Okay, I think you can. This is the game I've been working on as well. So you can have a script to kind of like move around the camera and then kind of like zoom in a bit as well. So there's much more that I've been doing with this 3D camera script. So like you can go up, down, go close, crane it in, dolly in, so to speak. Those are doable. One sec, let me go next. Yeah, so this is the way it's currently implemented in Ren'Py. Grab this from the documentation. It uses, the matrix coordinates to find out the positions and like the viewpoint. So I've talked about a bit of these like animations and ways you can position things. The next thing I want to mention is, I guess, just like, if programming in Python, like, keep track of variables. You can track very complex interactions with game state. So this game is called Long Live the Queen. I guess it's like fairly well known in like the independent circles, and you have very complicated variables which could determine if you die or live, and you have to raise the statistics of your player character by training her to survive. Yeah, and I guess another thing, I wonder if we're kind of cutting short on time, but like there's simple stuff you can implement, which is just like, if you know Python, you've done import random, import time, right? So I wanted to create a timer to tell the player how long they took to do an action. So then I was just like, well, create class, define methods, and get started. Yeah, so this stuff, you can go from like brain to keyboard to game. Wait, brain to keyboard to game. Yes. Yeah, so you can see, things are familiar with like decorators and like whatnot, to create. This is how I created like random dialogue. So it would pick from a list of utterances and like, interesting, whoa, like instead of just saying like, hey, 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 like each time, right? To kind of like make things a bit more varied here. So yeah, the outcome would be like a timer that tells you um the time it took for a player to do something, and then like kind of varied dialogue based on the situation. So that's all doable with like, the normal control flow and things like that in Ren'Py, right? If you have done Python control flow, you're good to go. I wanted to show some other screen customization things here. Yeah, so there can be like pretty varied UI. You can customize the UI quite a lot as well, because like these things are just like, like there could be a class for your menu item, and then you could just customize it as you wish and use them as you wish, and they will be fairly um, just like reusable in good design practices. Yeah, so I guess you could easily remake stuff like Bandersnatch in Ren'Py, and things like very complicated things like this. This is another tool called Twine that is like, it's not really it's not the same at all as Ren'Py, but I know people commonly use it to make these flowcharts, and actually the Bandersnatch developers had used this tool called Twine to create these branching narratives. But a lot of Ren'Py developers I know, they have also used this too. So yeah, I would say your imagination's the limit. Well, okay, just don't try to use it to make a first person shooter or like some other things that's like very 3D. Yeah, 2D narrative focused games are good to be made with Ren'Py, and you can make fairly high production quality stuff with Ren'Py, I would have to say. Yeah, and based on the design philosophy of Ren'Py, the creator has said, he wants it to be new programmer friendly and also flexible for seasoned developers. Actually, maybe I added this this second point. I think that it is fairly flexible if you want to modify anything or add any functionality, because there are some of the functionality that I have shown you that does not come out of the box, but with Python and some imagination, they can be done in Ren'Py. So thank you, Python. I think your vision did come true, as well as like all the other contributors to the open source project. So with Ren'Py, I made my first game. Right now, I'm in the process of making my second one. So I'd encourage you all to go make your story-driven game. And here's where you can find me. My studio is Quill Studios, but I also have a personal Twitter or LinkedIn for, I guess it's more like, which is more data science focused. And yeah, thank you so much, everyone.